On the whole, the village of St. Anselm regarded itself as extremely fortunate. It had an ancient church, a vicar given to mild sermons and vigorous gardening, a high street that still possessed a grocer, a chemist, and a rather superior tea shop, and, most importantly, no great excitement. That, at least, was the general view that floated pleasantly among the roses and cucumber sandwiches. On the afternoon, the Women's Garden Society held its annual tea. The tea that began, as so many things do, with the best of intentions. The rectory lawn had been mowed into obedient stripes. White chairs stood about like well-scrubbed children. Tables were spread with starched cloths that spoke eloquently of Mrs. Vickers' iron. It was a day of hats, broad-brimmed straw hat for Mrs. Bantry of the Limes, something small and aggressively chic for young Mrs. Julia West, and, under a rather old-fashioned but scrupulously tidy hat, the soft pink-apple face of Miss Jane Marple, visiting for a fortnight with her old friend, Mrs. Caroline West. "It's quite like St. Mary Mead, you know," Miss Marple observed, in her gentle, fluttering way as she settled herself at a table. "Garden societies are very much alike. So many good works, and so many small jealousies tucked away like bindweed among the roots." Muzzle West, a comfortable woman with anxious eyes, laughed in the manner of a person who would prefer not to understand the remark. "Now, Jane, you mustn't go seeing scandals in every flower bed. We are a very peaceful village." Miss Marple's blue eyes, which could on occasion be as sharp as embroidery needles, wandered thoughtfully over the scene. To the left, Mrs. Bantry presided with complacent authority over the prize roses, explaining loudly why no one else's climbers ever did quite as well. Near the tea table, Sergeant Owen, representing the local police in his off-duty jacket, hovered self-consciously near the cakes, as if reluctant to admit to greed under official eyes. And at the center of it all, like the hub of a well-oiled wheel, was Mrs. Lydia Harcourt. She was not, strictly speaking, a pretty woman, but she possessed that indefinable quality, poise, that village ladies alternately admired and resented. Lydia Harcourt, lately come to St. Anselm from London, had in a single year become chairwoman of the Garden Society, treasurer of the Church Restoration Fund, and patroness of every sale of work within 10 miles. Money, charm, and a certain glittering energy surrounded her like a faint perfume. "Lydia has done wonders," whispered Mrs. West to Miss Marple. "Why, the society was almost moribund before she came. Of course," her voice lowered further, "some of the older members feel she has gone a little too fast. Mrs. Bantry, for instance. Her nose was quite out of joint about the new voting system for the prize cups." Just then Lydia Harcourt herself approached, carrying a silver tray on which rested 12 delicate bone china cups, each patterned with tiny violets. They were empty. The teapot followed in the hands of the diffident vicar's wife. "Ah, Miss Marple," Lydia cried, with that bright air of instant intimacy which some people find irresistible and others distrust. "You must allow me to pour for you. I have heard such a great deal about you from dear Caroline." "I hope none of it was true," said Miss Marple mildly, accepting a cup. Her eyes rested for a fleeting second on the arrangement of cups on the tray. 12 of them, not one mismatched, gleaming whitely in the sun. Around them, the little social dramas of village life played out. Julia West, slim and pale, was arguing in low tones with a dark, foreign-looking young man whom several ladies had already decided not to approve of, old Mr. Pritchard, who had retired from something obscure in the city and now devoted himself to roses and indignation, was muttering to anyone who would listen about these new people coming in and taking over everything. "And the tulip cup," someone said behind Miss Marple, "ought to have gone to Mrs. Bantry, and everyone knows it." It was all exceedingly ordinary, exceedingly English, and exceedingly pleasant. Laughter drifted in the warm air. Teaspoons chimed lightly against fine porcelain. Bees hovered over the late-flowering lavender. The scream, when it came, cleaved through the afternoon like a knife. Chairs scraped harshly on the lawn. Miss Marple, turning her head with surprising swiftness for so frail-seeming a figure, saw Lydia Harcourt standing very straight by the tea table, one hand still resting on their silver tray of now empty cups. Her other hand clutched at her throat. Her lips moved soundlessly for an instant. Then Lydia Harcourt crumpled slowly and with terrible grace to the grass. By the time Sergeant Owen reached her, Lydia Harcourt was quite indisputably dead, and on the white cloth beside her lay 12 empty teacups, arranged with perfect, deadly symmetry. For an instant, there was a curious, almost reverent silence, as though the village itself held its breath. Then, as if some invisible cord had snapped, sound returned in a rush. Gasps, hurried footsteps, the brittle jangling of a fallen teaspoon, someone beginning to sob too loudly for the good manners. "Don't touch her! Nobody touch her!" cried the vicar's wife, then immediately flushed, as if fearing she had been too forward. Miss Marple had already risen, the knitting slipping quietly into the basket at her feet. She did not rush. She merely moved to a vantage point from which she might see everything. Years of experience had taught her that confusion was an excellent disguise for those who wished to take advantage of it. Caroline West fluttered at her elbow. "Oh, Jane, this is dreadful. Lydia, dead. It must be her heart. It must be. She overworked herself, I always said so." "People whose hearts are inclined to give way," Miss Marple said mildly, "do not, as a rule, scream first. They cannot spare the breath." Her quiet remark was lost amid the commotion. Constable Briggs, red in the face and slightly out of breath from having hurried across the lawn, knelt awkwardly beside the fallen woman, his hat askew. "Best send for Dr. Henderson," he muttered. "Though it won't do much good, I'm thinking." Young Julia West had pushed her way forward, pale but composed. "I'll telephone from the house," she said, then hesitated, her gaze flicking to the silver tray and its sinister circle of cups. "Mother, don't let anyone. Don't move anything." It was, Miss Marple reflected, a sensible reaction for a girl supposed to be rather feather-brained. Within 20 minutes, Dr. Henderson arrived, smelling of carbolic and pipe smoke, his manner brusque to disguise the fact that être de devil still troubled him. He examined Mrs. Harcourt with the weary efficiency of a man who had done this too many times in too many front parlors. "Dead?" Briggs asked unnecessarily. "Very," said the doctor. "And not from any failure of the heart, unless I'm much mistaken. There's a rigidity of the throat muscles, yes. I don't like the look of this at all." He glanced toward the table, the tea things, the immaculate silver, then back to Briggs. "You'll have to inform the chief inspector in Much Wentham. This is not a natural death." But the word, though not spoken aloud, traveled through the crowd like a chill. Murder. They said it later, of course, when they felt safer. Mrs. Bantry said it with relish, Mrs. Pritchard with pious horror, Mr. Pritchard with gloomy satisfaction, as if he had always expected such a thing to happen once all these new people came in. But in that first hour they contented themselves with phrases. Such a terrible thing, so sudden. You never can tell, can you? A picture of health, she seemed. While Briggs flustered and Dr. Henderson issued firm, practical instructions, Miss Marple's attention rested, not on the body, but on the living. The dark-haired stranger who had argued with Julia West now stood a little apart, shoulders tense, eyes narrowed, not with shock, but calculation. Bantry, that indefatigable gardener, looked rather too triumphant for decorum. The vicar's wife wrung her hands, casting guilty looks at the tea-table as though fearing she had been somehow remiss in the boiling of water. "And the tea, Briggs?" "Dr. Farsi," Henderson asked sharply, "has anyone else been taken ill?" "No, sir," Briggs said, scratching his head. "We all drank from the same pot, far as I can see. Just the one tray for the committee ladies here. 12 cups. Mrs. Harcourt poured them herself." 12, repeated Miss Marple, so quietly that only Caroline heard her. "How interesting. I counted 13 ladies with Lydia on the committee list you showed me yesterday, dear. Caroline blinked. Why, yes, there are 13, but Dora Hewitt sent her apologies. She's been poorly all week. She hesitated, though she did say she might look in, just for half an hour, if she felt well enough. Miss Marple's eyes returned to the ring of empty cups, 12 delicate vessels, their rims faintly stained with lipstick and tea, one bearing the merest chip along the saucer's edge. 12 cups, and one woman dead. In Miss Marple's experience, numbers in villages were rarely accidental. Inspector Craddock began his work with the calm, methodical air of a man determined not to be rushed by either hysteria or village indignation. He directed Constable Briggs to escort the ladies to the rectory drawing-room, where they might sit and, as the vicar's wife put it tremulously, collect themselves. In practice, this meant an explosion of whispered conjecture and carefully couched accusations. Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting dutifully resumed, appeared to take no notice of the rising tide of speculation. In reality, she heard every word. "I'm sure it must have been her heart," declared Mrs. Bantry, fanning herself vigorously. "Lydia was under so much strain lately. The business with the funds, you know." "Oh, you hadn't heard?" "Well, of course, one doesn't like to repeat gossip, but there were no funds missing," snapped Mrs. West sharply, her nerves clearly frayed. "It was a simple accounting discrepancy. Lydia said so herself." People often do," murmured Miss Marple, so gently that it seemed more a thought aloud than a contribution. "Though in my experience, discrepancies with money are very rarely simple." Julia West, who had been sitting rigidly in a straight-backed chair, suddenly rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where she began rearranging an already orderly row of porcelain figures. Her dark-haired companion, introduced earlier as Mr. Daniel Royce, watched her with a mixture of concern and something Miss Marple categorized as guilt, though the precise nature of that guilt remained to be seen. "It could have been something she ate," offered the vicar's wife, clasping and unclasping her hands. "Or a bee sting. My cousin's husband's sister once had a dreadful reaction. Doctor says poison," Mrs. Bantry interrupted with relish. "And where there's poison, there's murder. Mark my words. Someone wanted Lydia Harcourt out of the way." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "In a small place such as this," she said to no one in particular, "it is usually more a question of who did not want someone out of the way." Before anyone could respond, Inspector Craddock entered, his notebook already open. His glance paused a fraction of a second longer on Miss Marple than on the others, a fleeting recognition of previous encounters, before he addressed the room. "I'll need to speak with each of you in turn. For now, I'd like a general account of events leading up to Mrs. Harcourt's collapse." His gaze settled on Mrs. West. "You organized today's gathering, I believe." Mrs. West straightened in her chair. "Lydia did most of it," she said. "She insisted. The tea, the flowers, the prize ribbons, all Lydia. I only, I merely helped where I could." "And the tea service?" Craddock asked. "Who prepared it?" "The vicar's wife and I arranged the sandwiches," Mrs. West replied. "The maid laid the table. Lydia brought the tea set herself from Harcourt Cottage in a hat box. She was quite particular about it. She took the cups into the kitchen to be washed, said they must be fresh as dew for the occasion." "Who else was in the kitchen at that time?" Craddock's pencil hovered above the page. "The maid, of course," said the vicar's wife. "And Mrs. Pritchard came in to borrow a vase. Dora Hewitt popped her head in as well, though she didn't stay. She looked dreadful, poor thing, quite pale." Miss Marple's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly. "But Dora was unwell, was she not?" she asked mildly. "One wouldn't expect her to expend her strength visiting the kitchen. The garden would have been sufficient." The vicar's wife hesitated. "Well, yes, it did strike me as curious at the time, but Dora said she wanted to speak to Lydia about something privately." "Privately?" repeated Craddock. "You heard nothing of what passed between them?" "Only raised voices," admitted Mrs. West. "Dora seemed very upset. I heard her say, 'You can't do this, Lydia. It isn't fair.' Lydia told her not to make a scene. The atmosphere in the room shifted as each woman recalibrated her internal list of suspects. Dora Hewitt, with her absent seat at the table and her unexplained quarrel in the kitchen, rose several places at once. Miss Marple, however, was thinking of teacups. 12 cups, 11 ladies, one absent member who might or might not have been intended. In her experience, human beings were not nearly so precise as they are imagined to be, unless they were planning something very carefully indeed. "Inspector," she said gently, "do you happen to know whether Dora Hewitt ever did arrive at the garden this afternoon? It would be so unfortunate if illness prevented her from attending entirely." Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with a soft snap. "As a matter of fact, Miss Marple, we've already sent Constable Briggs to her cottage to make inquiries." He paused, his expression grave. "Because if Mrs. Hewitt did come to the rectory grounds today," he added slowly, "then several people here have been decidedly economical with the truth." Inspector Craddock's remark about the 12th cup seemed to linger in the heavy air of the drawing room long after he fell silent. No one volunteered an explanation. Eyes shifted. Hands smoothed skirts unnecessarily. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic click of Miss Marple's needles. Craddock, who had come to recognize that small domestic sound as heralding the emergence of inconvenient truth, glanced toward her with wary respect. "You think, Miss Marple, that the extra cup was not an oversight?" "Oh, I hardly think so," she replied mildly. "One learns in village life that some people are always exact about their accounts, their arrangements, their invitations. Mrs. Harcourt, from all I observe, was such a person. Allowing for one extra cup would have served some purpose in her mind. The question, as you so rightly put it, is whose purpose in the end it truly served." He hesitated. "You believe the 12th cup relates to the murderer?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that when something appears unnecessary, one should ask whether it was meant to appear so. In my experience, murderers rely quite heavily on other people not asking that particular question." Craddock closed his notebook. "I must send those cups and the teapot to the lab, though I dare say we can predict what they'll find. Meanwhile, there's Miss Dora Hewitt, the missing committee member. If 12 cups were prepared, and she was not expected, that would be strange. But if she was expected by someone, then the mathematics become more interesting." Miss Marple agreed, her eyes serene. "Dora lives alone at Orchard Cottage, does she not, Caroline?" Mrs. West started slightly, then nodded. "Yes, poor soul. Not much company besides her roses. I can take you there, Inspector, if you wish." "That would be helpful," Craddock said. He paused, then added with a studied casualness, "Miss Marple, if you are not too fatigued—" "Oh, not in the least," she said promptly. "An afternoon drive is often so beneficial for one's circulation." The small party, Craddock, Mrs. West, and Miss Marple, walked out to the lane where the inspector's car waited. As they drove the short distance through the village, Miss Marple watched the houses slip by with that particular, attentive gaze that made many people feel they had been gently, but thoroughly inspected. They turned into a narrow, overhung lane and stopped before a low, whitewashed cottage almost buried beneath climbing roses now past their prime. Mrs. West led the way up the path, knocking gently. After a moment, the door opened a cautious inch, then wider, revealing Miss Dora Hewitt. She looked as though the slightest puff of wind might blow her away. A thin, fluttering woman with iron-gray hair escaping from a bun and a cardigan hanging limply from narrow shoulders. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw, beneath the frailty, a tightness around the mouth that spoke of long-contended fears. "Inspector Craddock," Dora whispered, her gaze darting from one face to another. "I thought you'd be coming." "You heard then?" he asked. Dora's hand hovered at her throat. "One hears everything in St. Anselm." "Inspector, even when one doesn't wish to. May we come in?" Miss Marple asked gently in the tone of an old friend rather than an inquisitor. It's grown quite chilly. Inside, the cottage smelled of lavender polish and overboiled cabbage. They settled awkwardly in the small sitting room, Dora perched on the edge of a chair, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. You didn't attend the Garden Society tea? Craddock began. I wasn't well, Dora replied quickly. I sent word. The doctor's been treating my chest. He said I mustn't overexert myself. Miss Marple studied her thin, shaking hands. And yet, she said softly, you walked to the rectory kitchen this morning to speak with Mrs. Harcourt. Dora flinched as if struck. Who told you that? The vicar's wife, dear. She heard raised voices. It must have been very upsetting for you to quarrel with her so publicly after all this time. Dora's eyes filled with sudden, helpless tears. I didn't mean to quarrel. I only begged her not to go through with it. I said it wasn't right, what she was planning, that people would be hurt. What was she planning? Craddock asked sharply. Dora pressed the handkerchief to her mouth. For a moment it seemed she would refuse to speak. Then she whispered. She said she was going to make everything proper in St. Anselm, that secrets were unhealthy things. She had a list, Inspector, a list of people and what she knew about them. She said she'd start with the Garden Society Committee, that by this afternoon, no one in the village would be able to pretend any longer. Miss Marple's needles were still now, lying quietly in her lap. And you, Dora? She asked in that same gentle voice. Were you on that list? Dora looked at her with something like despair. Oh yes, Miss Marple, she whispered. I was, and if you knew what she held over me, you'd understand why someone might have wished her dead. Inspector Craddock turned the little vial over in his fingers, thoughtful lines deepening about his mouth. You realize, Mrs. Hewitt, this gives you a very particular connection to the method of murder. Dora flinched. You think I killed her? But she meant to kill me. On the contrary, Craddock said, his tone professionally neutral, I think it gives you a very particular motive. A woman discovers that someone plans to poison her. She decides to strike first. She has the very means at hand. It was an entirely reasonable deduction. Several of the ladies drew in little gasps, as if this explanation offered them the comfort of order. A potential murderer neatly labeled, a narrative they could understand. Miss Marple, however, resumed her knitting and studied Dora Hewitt's face. Terror, yes. Guilt, no. Not that dull, careful watchfulness she had so often observed in the truly guilty. Dora looked like a woman so frightened she had overstepped even her capacity for fear. I never touched the teacups, Dora protested faintly. I never came near them after she left my cottage. I didn't even come to the tea, not until after... Her voice faltered. Miss Marple, with her delicate instincts for timing, interjected before Craddock could press the point. If I may, Inspector, she said mildly, there is something that strikes me as very peculiar indeed. Mrs. Hewitt was not present when the tea was poured. The cups were observed on the tray by several ladies. All were filled by Mrs. Harcourt herself, according to Mrs. Clement. Yet only one cup contained poison. That suggests a rather more intimate knowledge of which cup would be offered to which person. Craddock regarded her with a mixture of respect and exasperation. And what does that suggest to you, Miss Marple? In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple began, as though embarking on a harmless anecdote. We once had a very troublesome woman who delighted in arranging the seating at church socials in the most malicious fashion. She would place Mrs. Lumley beside the man who was rumored to have jilted her in youth, and poor Mr. Trowbridge opposite the lady who had once refused his hand in marriage. She knew exactly where each person would sit because she had, over many months, established their little habits. How they always chose a certain chair or corner. Are you suggesting, Craddock said slowly, that Mrs. Harcourt planned not only who should drink from the poisoned cup, but where they would sit to receive it? It would be quite in character, don't you think? Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Harcourt appears to have been methodical in everything. If she meant Dora to drink that particular cup of tea, she would have arranged things so that Dora must, inevitably, sit in a certain place. Mrs. Clement spoke up unexpectedly. Lydia was always particular about Dora sitting on her right at meetings. Said it made it easier for her to hear the minutes being read. She'd often say, "Dora, dear, you must sit here, by me." "There you are, Inspector," Miss Marple said serenely, "a creature of habit. One could safely prepare for Dora Hewitt to sit in that exact place. And thus, one could safely poison the cup intended for that position. But Dora never came," Craddock pointed out. "So, how did the poisoned cup find its way into Mrs. Harcourt's hands?" "That," Miss Marple said, her eyes thoughtful, "is precisely the point on which everything turns. Did Mrs. Harcourt drink from the cup she had intended for another? Or did someone with a knowledge equal to her own of chairs and habits and little social arrangements contrive that exchange?" The question hung in the air. Outside, the late afternoon light had begun to soften. Shadows lengthening across the rectory lawn, where the white-clothed tables still stood, mute witnesses to the afternoon's violence. Craddock sighed. For the moment, the facts remained these. Mrs. Harcourt had access to cyanide. Mrs. Hewitt had a vial of it given to her this morning, and 1 cup out of 12 was poisoned. Until I have evidence otherwise, I must regard Mrs. Hewitt as a person of considerable interest. He signaled to Constable Briggs. "You will remain in the village, Mrs. Hewitt," he said formally. "I must ask that you do not leave St. Anselm without informing the police." When Dora had been led away, Miss Marple watched the inspector close his notebook with the air of a man who believes his path clear. It was at such moments she knew that one must be particularly careful. "You're not satisfied, are you, Jane?" Mrs. West whispered when they were briefly alone. "My dear Caroline," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "I am never satisfied when a solution depends upon a frightened, rather foolish woman displaying a degree of cunning she has never before shown in her life. No, Dora Hewitt is afraid, certainly. But not, I think, of what she has done." Her eyes strayed to the window, where Julia West and Mr. Thornton stood apart from the others, deep in urgent conversation. "The person we must look for," Miss Marple added, almost to herself, "is someone who understands habit, someone who counts, not only cups, but chairs and secrets and obligations. And such people, in my experience, rarely act in panic." The discovery of the Reverend Clement's absence produced immediate agitation among the ladies, but Miss Marple regarded the development with a sort of patient melancholy, though she had seen such patterns unfold many times before. Men who bear the weight of others' sins upon their consciences sometimes feel compelled to walk alone, she remarked to Mrs. West as they made their way back toward the rectory. Though whether the burden is guilt or merely horror is not always immediately apparent. Inspector Craddock, distracted by the problem of the missing clergyman, arranged for the guest to be escorted home under Constable Briggs's watchful eye. The Garden Society's immaculate tire, with its lace doilies and carefully arranged sandwiches, broke apart into small knots of anxious conversation that trailed away into the soft dusk. Mrs. West insisted that Miss Marple spend the night at her cottage, rather than at the small inn where she had originally taken rooms. "You'll be more comfortable here, Jane. And if I'm honest, I should be very glad of the company." The idea that Lydia was murdered, and perhaps not even intentionally the first time, has us all quite undone. Later, in the cozy sitting room with its chintz-covered chair and ticky-agging mantel clock, the day's events were turned over and examined again, like a curious stone found in an otherwise ordinary garden bed. The lamplight cast a warm glow over Miss Marple's serene face as she knitted, the steady rhythm of her needles somehow soothing. "It's the Reverend that troubles me," Caroline West confessed, curling her hands around her teacup. "If he has nothing to hide, why disappear? It gives such an appearance of guilt." "Appearances," Miss Marple murmured, "are very often arranged, my dear, like a shop window. meant to direct the eye away from the less attractive stock in the back. Julia and her fiancé had joined them briefly before returning to the vicarage. Julia insisting on checking on Mrs. Clement and Mr. Thornton perhaps anxious to demonstrate his respectability by such solicitous conduct. Their visit had left behind an impression of tension barely held in check. "Did you notice," Miss Marple asked quietly after they left, "how very eager Mr. Thornton was to mention seeing the Reverend near the tea tray?" His information was undoubtedly useful, and yet it came with such careful reluctance that one is tempted to examine it more closely. Mrs. West frowned. "You think he might have been lying?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that memory is a curious thing. People tend to recall those details which place themselves in a favorable light and others in a less favorable one. And Mr. Thornton is, after all, a stranger here. Strangers sometimes see more than they should, and sometimes less." Outside, the village settled into uneasy quiet. Curtains twitched, lamps were extinguished one by one, and behind closed doors St. Anselm's inhabitants dissected the day's catastrophe with the ruthless thoroughness of people who, under normal circumstances, restricted their judgments to gardens and church hats. At the police station, Inspector Craddock sat alone at his desk, reviewing his notes with increasing dissatisfaction. The situation, when reduced to ink on paper, seemed at once too simple and too complicated. Mrs. Harcourt had clearly intended to poison Dora Hewitt. Someone had just as clearly caused her to drink the poison herself. The Reverend Clement's unexplained absence made him an obvious suspect, yet Craddock could not shake Miss Marple's quiet warning about obvious answers. His pen paused over one particular line. "Mrs. Harcourt, amateur photographer. Dark room at cottage. Frequent purchases of chemicals from Kingsbury's pharmacy." The connection between the cyanide solution and her hobby was clear enough, and yet something about it nagged at him. He underlined the words, "dark room at cottage," and made a note to visit the place first thing in the morning. At nearly the same hour, Miss Marple, preparing for bed in Caroline West's guest room with its faded rose wallpaper, paused before extinguishing the lamp. She had laid out her knitting neatly, the ball of soft grey wool precisely placed, but her thoughts were not on patterns and stitches. "Poison planned for one, taken by another," she murmured to herself. A tray rotated when no one was watching. A missing clergyman, a frightened woman with a vial she did not drink, and a village full of small secrets now overshadowed by a very large one. She reached to turn down the lamp, then hesitated. A tiny frown creasing her brow. Some small, niggling detail eluded her. Something about the cups, the number 12, and Lydia Harcourt's insistence that all committee members be present. Of course, she thought, as sleep finally began to claim her. One ought always to ask not only who was meant to drink from the poisoned cup, but who knew they were meant to drink from it. In the darkness, the village held its breath, unaware that before another day had passed, another revelation would disturb its fragile little calm and twist the pattern of the case into an even more intricate design. Night came down over St. Anselm with a softness that belied the tension coiled in the rectory drawing-room. Lamps had been lit, casting yellow pools bold upon anxious faces. The tea-things remained where they were in the garden, cordoned off and ghostly in the dusk. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender furniture polish and something sharper, fear tinged with resentment. Inspector Craddock, having taken the Reverend Clement's statement, stood by the mantelpiece, weighing his next question. Miss Marple sat a little apart, apparently absorbed in picking up a dropped stitch. In reality, her pale blue eyes missed very little. "You say you could not see the person's face, Reverend?" Craddock said at last. "But you are certain of the gloves?" "Quite certain," Clement replied. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles prominent. Thick leather stained along the fingers. I remember thinking they were most unsuitable for a tea party. "Garden gloves," Miss Marple murmured. "One so often sees those brownish stains upon them. Soil, of course. but also the residue from fertilizers and sprays. They never do quite come out, however one scrubs. Mrs. Bantry sniffed. "Most of us keep a pair in the potting shed," she said sharply. "It proves nothing at all. Besides, I was at the pond, as everyone knows, trying to rescue my hat." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed placidly, "though I expect the ladies of the Garden Society differ considerably in the state of their gloves. There are those who truly dig and weed, and there are those who prefer to direct, as one might say, from the path." A faint flush rose in Mrs. Bantry's cheeks. Mrs. West, who actually did weed her own borders, looked suddenly thoughtful. Craddock seized on the more practical thread. "Constable Briggs, first thing in the morning, I want you to visit each committee member's house. Ask to see their gardening gloves. All of them. No exceptions." "Tomorrow?" Mrs. Clement's voice rose in dismay. "Must this horrid business continue into Sunday, Inspector?" "I'm afraid murder doesn't keep the Sabbath, madam," Craddock replied, though not unkindly. Julia West had been very quiet, her fingers laced with Mr. Thornton's. Now she spoke, her voice low but steady. "Inspector, there is something you should know about Lydia's photography. It might explain why she had access to so many chemicals." Craddock turned to her. "Go on, Miss West." "Lydia liked to say her camera never lied," Julia said. "But what she didn't say was that she always kept copies of everything. She photographed garden parties, fetes, even private dinners, and then filed the negatives away. She claimed it was for the parish history, but I once saw—" She hesitated, eyes dropping. Thornton gave her hand a small, encouraging squeeze. "I saw an envelope in her bureau drawer," Julia continued. "It was labeled with my name. When I asked about it, she smiled and said, 'Insurance is such a sensible thing for a woman alone, don't you think?' After that, I had the distinct impression she kept evidence on everyone. Not just secrets told, but things she could prove." Miss Marple looked up, interest sharpening. "Ah, not merely gossip then, but documentation. How very modern of her. Blackmail supported by photographic records is a much more dangerous occupation than simple village tittle-tattle." "Which would explain why she felt so secure," Craddock said. "But it also means those records must be somewhere. At her cottage, most likely. If we can find them, we'll have a clearer idea who had the most to fear from today's revelations." "It won't be as simple as searching a drawer," Miss Marple observed. "A woman who organizes seating charts with such care is unlikely to leave incriminating evidence lying about. I imagine there will be a system. One does learn such things in villages, you know. People who keep other people's secrets usually have to keep them very tidily." Dora Hewitt, who had been sitting silent with her shawl drawn tight, suddenly shivered. "If you go to her cottage, Inspector, be careful. Lydia showed me her dark room once. She said there were places in that house where no one would ever think to look." "That sounds almost like an invitation," Thornton remarked dryly. "From beyond the grave." Craddock straightened, decision made. "Very well. Miss Marple, Mrs. West, I'll ask Audiobook. And you two both, to the extent you feel able, to accompany me in the morning. You know village houses and village minds better than I do. If Mrs. Harcourt left us a trail, I suspect you'll be quicker to see it." Miss Marple inclined her head, the faintest hint of satisfaction in her eyes. "Why, Inspector, if I can be of the smallest assistance, I shall be very pleased. Murder does so often lurk in the corners where housekeeping and human nature meet." As the party at last began to disperse, each person returning to a house that now felt less secure than it had that morning, Miss Marple stepped for a moment onto the darkened lawn. The 12 empty cups still gleamed faintly in the moonlight, pale little ghosts of the afternoon's gaiety. She stood very still, listening to the faint clink of china in the night air, as if the arrangement itself were trying to tell her something. It was not, she reflected, only the rotation of the tray that mattered, but who would have known to fear the cup in the first place? Morning came to see it all. Selm, with that deceptive clarity peculiar to English villages after a storm of any kind. Meteorological or otherwise, the sky was a bright, innocent blue. The church bell rang for early prayers, and milk was delivered to doorsteps as usual. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a ferment of speculation more potent than any weather. Miss Marple, having risen early, as was her habit, sat at Caroline West's breakfast table with a modest boiled egg and a pot of tea. Caroline, by contrast, toyed with her toast in distracted agitation. "It's all anyone can talk about," she said, buttering the same slice for the third time. "The telephone hasn't stopped. Half the village is convinced the Reverend is behind it all. The other half thinks it's that Mr. Thornton, with his city ways and mysterious background. Poor Julia. This will quite ruin her." Miss Marple spread marmalade with neat precision. "Murder is rather inclined to ruin everyone it touches, dear. Both the innocent and the guilty. Though in my experience, scandal often distorts itself to focus on the person least able to defend themselves." Caroline looked at her shrewdly. "You don't believe it was the Reverend?" "I believe," Miss Marple replied gently, "that the Reverend Clement is a kind man who makes poor tea and worse financial decisions, but I doubt he possesses the particular coolness of mind required to reverse both a serving pattern and a secret marking system in the midst of social confusion. That suggests someone more accustomed to someone for whom detail is not an incidental, but a habit." A knock at the door interrupted them. Inspector Craddock stood on the threshold, looking as though he had slept in his clothes. "Miss Marple, Mrs. West." "My apologies for the hour. We're going to Mrs. Harcourt's cottage. I thought you might be interested in accompanying us." Caroline started to protest about impropriety, but Miss Marple merely reached for her shawl. "It is astonishing," she remarked mildly as they stepped out into the crisp air, "how much people reveal of themselves in the way they keep house." Lydia Harcourt's cottage stood at the far edge of the village, its climbing roses and freshly painted door presenting an image of charming order. In saying, however, that order took on a more chilling quality. Every object seemed placed with mathematical precision. Books aligned by height and subject, cushions centered exactly, flowers arranged at symmetrical angles. Craddock moved first toward the small study, where a large writing desk dominated the room. "Briggs," he said, "start with that bureau. If there are photographic records, they'll be there." Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to a corkboard above the desk. Neatly pinned index cards formed a grid, each bearing a name in Lydia's tidy hand. Mrs. Bantry, Dora Hewitt, Julia West, Reverend Clement, even Caroline West, with a short notation, "Financial strain, brother's debts, confirm." "How very methodical," Miss Marple murmured. A catalogue of vulnerabilities like seeds sorted by planting season. Below each name were cryptic notes in fine pencil, dates, locations, brief descriptive phrases. Library, closed hours. Meeting, Old Quarry Lane. Check, unexplained. Village life, reduced to leverage. "Here, sir," called Briggs from the bureau. He had opened a lower drawer to reveal a series of envelopes, each labeled with a name corresponding to the cards. Inside were photographs, some merely unflattering, others clearly compromising. A late-night meeting behind the Lamb and Flag, an exchange of money outside the post office. Julia, in London years earlier, arm in arm with a man who was decidedly not Mr. Thornton. Caroline made a small, horrified sound. "She kept it all, every little thing." "Blackmail supported by documentation," Craddock said grimly. "Enough to control half the village for years." Miss Marple, meanwhile, had drifted toward a narrow door at the back of the study. "This will be her dark room, I imagine," she said, opening it without waiting for permission. The small space was windowless, illuminated only by a red lamp. Trays, bottles, and drying lines filled the room, all in perfect order. On the bench lay a pair of thick leather gardening gloves, their cuffs slightly stained. Found your missing gloves, Inspector, Miss Marple said quietly. Craddock examined them, his expression sharpening. These aren't the rector's. Different size. And these stains, Doctor? Henderson, who had joined them from his morning rounds, sniffed carefully. Chemical. Fixer or developer? Possibly both. And here, he pointed to faint discoloration along the fingertips. I wouldn't be surprised if this is from handling cyanide solution. Miss Marple's gaze moved to a small notebook beside the gloves. On the first page, Lydia had written, Schedule, printing for tomorrow. 12 enlargements. Committee portraits, insurance set. How inconvenient, Miss Marple murmured. For someone who had rather a lot to lose were those portraits to be circulated. Craddock looked from the gloves to the notebook, then back toward the study where the envelopes lay. Whoever killed her didn't just want Lydia stopped. They wanted her records, either destroyed or controlled, and someone knew precisely where to find both gloves and chemicals. And perhaps, Miss Marple added softly, they knew her habits well enough to use her own tools against her. In my experience, Inspector, the person best positioned to turn a blackmailer's methods back upon them is rarely the one most loudly suspected. From the front hall came Briggs's voice. Sir, there's something odd with these photographs. Some envelopes are missing. Miss Marple's needles, tucked in her handbag, lay silent. But in her mind, the pattern was beginning to form with painful clarity. Julia West entered the cottage with an air of someone who had rehearsed a speech and was now determined to deliver it before courage failed. Her eyes flicked over the files and photographs on the desk, the open drawers, the exposed system of control, and a faint shudder passed through her. So it's all here, she said quietly. Every little weakness, every mistake anyone ever made. Inspector Craddock gestured to a chair, but she remained standing, hands tightly clasped. Mr. Thornton, having followed her in, hovered protectively just behind her shoulder. Miss West, Craddock began. We've been examining Mrs. Harcourt's records. They paint a rather troubling picture of her relationship with you. Troubling? Julia gave a brittle laugh. That's a gentle word for it. She destroyed my mother, you know, long before we came to St. Anselm. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Destroyed, my dear? Lydia was always like this, Julia said, a note of weary bitterness entering her voice. In London, she ran a ladies' circle, charity work and social teas, all very respectable on the surface. But she collected information there, too. When my father's business failed, she made sure no one would help us. She hinted at improprieties, debts, moral failings. Mother never recovered from the humiliation. And yet you accepted her invitation to St. Anselm, Craddock pointed out. Her sponsorship, even. I thought it was a chance to start again, Julia replied. Lydia said country life would do me good, that she'd see me placed respectably. I didn't understand until too late that she meant placed under her thumb. When I became engaged to Edward, she glanced back at Thornton. She said I was ungrateful, that she still had material from London. Material in the form of photographs? Miss Marple inquired, her tone mild. Julia's gaze moved to the dark-room door, then back. Yes, some perfectly innocent, some made to look otherwise. She kept them as leverage against many people, not just me. Mr. Thornton stepped forward. I came when Julia wrote to me in desperation. I've dealt with people like Mrs. Harcourt before in business. I meant only to frighten her into leaving Julia alone. Craddock's voice was cool. Is that why you were asking your landlady about photography chemicals, and why your gloves show traces of those same chemicals? Thornton hesitated, and it was Miss Marple who gently supplied the missing words. You were trying to understand her methods, weren't you, Mr. Thornton? A wise general studies the enemy's weapons. I didn't touch her chemicals, he protested quickly. I asked about them, yes, whether they were dangerous, whether she might be breaking any regulations. I hoped to find some legal way to stop her. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. And did you and Lydia quarrel? Oh, yes, Julia said before he could answer. The day before the tea. I heard them from the passage. Edward told her he knew about London, that if she harmed me again, he'd go to the police with what he knew of her other activities. Other activities? Craddock repeated. Julia bit her lip, then nodded toward one of the open files. Not everyone in London survived her attentions. There was a woman, Mrs. Ellison. She took her own life after Lydia's little campaign of moral improvement. Edward knew the family. Thornton's jaw tightened. Her death was recorded as suicide, but it was Lydia who supplied the rope in every sense that mattered. Silence fell, heavier than before. Motive grew darker, more personal. Miss Marple watched Julia with that deceptively gentle gaze which saw so much. There was genuine pain there, yes, and fear, but something else, too. A quick, calculating awareness whenever the conversation touched on the mechanics of Lydia's schemes. "Tell me, my dear," Miss Marple said as if idly, "had you ever seen Mrs. Harcourt prepare tea before? At other gatherings? Not here, perhaps, but in London?" Julia hesitated a fraction too long. She was always particular about such things, she answered carefully. She liked to control every detail, even down to how she marked special cups. Miss Marple's fingers rested lightly on the little notebook by the gloves. Tiny differences in pattern, for instance. Julia's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, and Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime watching such betrayals of composure, filed the reaction away without comment. "Inspector," she said instead, turning to Craddock with the air of someone making a small domestic suggestion, "this whole business of serving patterns and marked cups is really, quite confusing, isn't it? I've sometimes found that when things become too intricate, the best solution is to simplify. Perhaps we might arrange a little tea of our own this afternoon. A very small one, with the same cups in the same order, only this time without poison." Julia looked up sharply. Thornton's hand tightened on her arm. Craddock, catching the glint in Miss Marple's eyes, nodded slowly. "A reconstruction, you mean?" "Not precisely," Miss Marple replied, her smile as mild as ever. "More a social experiment. I've always believed that when people are placed once again in the exact conditions of their crime, or of someone else's, they sometimes show us more than they intend." And, as Julia West looked from the old lady to the inspector, a faint, involuntary flicker of fear crossed her face, so fleeting that most would have missed it. Miss Marple, of course, did not. By late afternoon, the rectory garden had once again become the stage for politely contained drama. The same white-clothed table stood under the cherry tree, the same silver tray gleaming faintly in the light, though now the 12 china cups held only clear water. Inspector Craddock had gathered the principal figures: Mrs. Bantry, Dora Hewitt, the Clements, Julia and Mr. Thornton, Mrs. West, at Miss Marple's gentle but insistent suggestion. "If you please," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "We will simply do what Mrs. Harcourt herself intended to do yesterday, only without the poison. Repetition can be most revealing, I always think. Human beings so dislike doing the same wrong thing twice." She took the seating diagram from her reticule and laid it on the table. "Here is how Mrs. Harcourt planned the tea. Dora Hewitt here, directly opposite her, Mrs. Bantry at her right hand, Mrs. Clement to her left, Julia and the others in their appointed places. Inspector, would you be so good as to indicate those positions?" Craddock obliged, placing little slips of paper with each lady's name around the table. The arrangement matched the chart exactly. "Now," Miss Marple continued, "we know from several accounts that Mrs. Harcourt served clockwise, beginning with the guest of honor at her right, the chair she had reserved for Mrs. Hewitt. We also know that she marked the poisoned cup by reversing the painted violets. She lifted one cup, its flowers pointing the opposite way, and placed it in front of Dora's empty chair. Here, at position 1. The assembled villagers watched in tense silence. "Next, we have the original impressions of the tray's feet in the tablecloth," Miss Marple went on. "You can still see them faintly. The tray at first stood so. But when we found it after the tragedy, it had moved, turned a quarter circle. She positioned the heavy tray over the faint depressions, then rotated it deliberately. The handles shifted, the cups all changed relative position. Miss Marple's frail hands were steady. "You see, Inspector? The cup, originally meant for Dora, is now here," she pointed, in front of the place where Mrs. Harcourt herself stood to take her tea. "A simple rotation," Craddock agreed. "We established that much yesterday, Miss Marple. What we have not yet established is who turned it." "Huh?" said Miss Marple. But that is not quite all that was done." She picked up the reversed violet cup, and with almost ceremonial care, turned it so the violets pointed clockwise like the others. Remember, Miss Harcourt relied not only on her serving order, but on this private marker. Someone who merely rotated the tray would still have left her warned. Someone who reversed the cup as well understood her methods very intimately. Her gentle gaze passed over each face before resting finally on Mrs. Bantry. "A war nurse," Miss Marple said softly, as though, thinking aloud, would know a very great deal about poisons, and about how easily they might be traced. She would also know that if a certain woman intended to murder one patient, yet had 12 possible witnesses, that woman was a very dangerous creature indeed. Mrs. Bantry's mouth tightened. "If you're implying—" "Do let me finish, dear," Miss Marple said, still in that mild tone. "You see, only one person here both knew Mrs. Harcourt's habits from long committee work and had, quite literally, stood at her elbow as she arranged such things. Only one person visited her cottage repeatedly in the last week, under the pretext of roses, and so could observe her photographing, her chemicals, even her little system with the violet patterns." Briggs shifted uneasily. "We found your fingerprints at the cottage, ma'am, on the dark room door, and on the filing cabinet marked with your name." Bantry's color rose. "Of course you did. That woman summoned me there, to gloat, waved those old planning maps under my nose, told me my entire rose garden stood on land that was never properly granted. 30 years of work she was prepared to call encroachment. She threatened my husband's reputation, my own. I make no denial of that. And she followed it," Miss Marple said gently, "with an invitation you could not refuse, a public tea, where she meant to expose you before all your friends. You saw the seating chart, I think?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes flicked once, involuntarily, to the paper. "You saw that Dora was to be humiliated first," Miss Marple went on. "A sick woman, the least able to bear it. You saw the 12 cups, the reversed one set before her name. And being a very shrewd woman, you put things together, her sudden tonic, the cyanide bottle in the dark room, the insistence that Dora must attend." Silence pressed down upon the garden. Mrs. Bantry's hands gripped the back of her chair. "You didn't fetch cyanide from your own conservatory," Miss Marple said. "You were wiser than that. You used hers. You wore her gloves, and when the hat blew off—" "You arranged that," Craddock cut in, comprehension dawning. "You made a little fuss about the breeze, took off your hat ostentatiously, placed it where it would easily fall, created your own distraction." "A perfectly natural little accident," Miss Marple agreed. "Then, while everyone ran, you and the Reverend came to the table, he meaning to stop a murder, you to redirect it. He hesitated. You did not. You turned the tray, turned the cup, and walked away, knowing that Lydia Harcourt's own precision would complete the work for you. All eyes were on Mrs. Bantry now. Her shoulders sagged, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its imperious strength. "She would have destroyed Dora," she whispered, "and Julia, and the Clements, and me. All of us, one by one, as she destroyed others before. I thought—" She swallowed. "I thought it fitting that she should drink what she'd mixed for someone weaker. Call it justice, if you like." "No," Craddock said quietly. "We call it murder." Miss Marple's needles lay still in her lap. Her expression held no triumph, only a grave, sorrowing comprehension. "Justice," she said, "is a very dangerous thing when one undertakes to administer it personally, dear Mrs. Bantry. It has a way of turning like a tea tray and coming to rest in very unexpected places." Dora Hewitt's slight figure, walking between Inspector Craddock and Constable Briggs, seemed to take something intangible with it. Some accumulated weight of shared guilt and unspoken fear. When she disappeared through the rectory gate, a curious stillness settled over the garden, as though the air itself were relieved that the tension had finally resolved into something solid and nameable. Mrs. Bantry was the first to speak, her usual brusqueness tempered by an unfamiliar gravity. "I suppose we must all accept our share of blame," she said, looking not at Miss Marple or the inspector, but at the white cloth and empty cups. "We all knew in our different ways what Lydia was. We let her go on because it was easier to hope she'd turn on someone else rather than ourselves. It is a very common tendency," Miss Marple observed gently, resuming her seat beneath the cherry tree. "In gardens, one sometimes allows a particularly vigorous plant to overrun its neighbors because removing it would be messy. One tells oneself it is not doing too much harm, but by the time one acts, half the bed is strangled." Mrs. Clement sank down beside her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Dora, who used to bring flowers for the altar every third Sunday," she said in a strained whisper. "She never complained, never hinted at any of this. I thought her merely shy. And all the while Lydia was using her cottage as a sort of rehearsal room for cruelty." Julia West and Mr. Thornton stood a little apart from the others. Julia's eyes were red but dry. Her grief, Miss Marple thought, was of a complex kind. Grief for her mother, for Dora, perhaps even for herself. "I warned her," Julia murmured. "I wanted her to be ready to defend herself with words, with the truth. I never imagined she would—" She broke off, biting her lip. "You warned her, because you knew exactly what Lydia was capable of," Miss Marple said softly. "Zish!" "That, too, is a form of kindness, my dear. Though kindness may have unexpected consequences when applied to a desperate heart." Mr. Thornton's jaw tightened. "Will they—" he began, then stopped, looking toward the gate where Dora had vanished. "Will they hang her, do you think?" Inspector Craddock had returned, his face composed but not unfeeling. "That, Mr. Thornton, will be for the proper authorities to decide," he said. "The law acknowledges provocation and long-standing torment, though it cannot quite forgive them. There will be inquiries, medical examinations. But whatever happens, the truth of Mrs. Harcourt's conduct will not be buried." "Nor should it be," Miss Marple added, her voice as mild as ever, but her eyes very clear. "People like Mrs. Harcourt flourish in darkness, behind closed doors, in whispered threats, in private appointments. Sunlight is a very effective disinfectant, though it does come late, more often than one would wish." The rector, standing beside his wife, looked deeply shaken. "I did suspect something," he confessed quietly, "in Dora's manner, in Lydia's tone when she spoke of helping her. I told myself it wasn't my place to pry into private arrangements between parishioners." He looked at Miss Marple with a kind of tired humility. "I was wrong." "It is very difficult," she replied kindly, "to know when one should intervene, particularly where respectability is involved. Lydia had all the right manners, all the right phrases. People who do harm seldom appear as villains, Mr. Clement. That is one of the great inconveniences of life." Gradually, like birds returning after a storm, conversation resumed in small, subdued patches. The vicar's wife insisted on making fresh tea. Proper tea without drama, as she put it tremulously. And cups were passed around with an almost ceremonial care. No one failed to notice that each lady now watched very closely which cup she received. As Miss Marple accepted her own, she regarded it with a faint, almost whimsical smile. "You see," she remarked to Caroline West, who had come to sit beside her, "we shall all be thinking about teacups for quite some time. That at least may be an improvement. People are often far too careless about the small things in life. And it is so often in the small things that danger hides. Caroline shivered. I shall never be able to look at a tray of cups again without counting them, Jane. That may be no bad habit to acquire, Miss Marple replied. Counting is a kind of respect for objects, for people, for the order of things. Lydia counted for control. Dora counted for survival. We, perhaps, may count as a form of remembrance. The garden, with its clipped borders and respectable shrubs, seemed slowly to reclaim itself from the spectre of death. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a child laughed, a dog barked, and the faint chime of the church clock drifted across the afternoon air. Life in St. Anselm, Miss Marple reflected, would continue with its usual rhythms, services and socials, gossip and gardening, but something essential had shifted beneath the surface. She sipped her tea thoughtfully. Human nature, she knew, would not change. There would always be Lydia Harcourts, those who used knowledge as a weapon, and there would always be Doras, who endured in silence until endurance became impossible. One could not prevent such tragedies altogether. But one could, perhaps, learn to look more closely at the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who always arrived with flowers and went home alone. It was 2 days later, in the calmer, cooler light of a St. Anselm morning, that Miss Marple sat with Caroline West in the latter's sunny drawing-room, the newspaper folded neatly on the little table between them. The case of Mrs. Lydia Harcourt had moved from urgent whispers to printed fact, rendered curiously bloodless in the formal language of the county press. "Distressing occurrence at village tea," Caroline read aloud, adjusting her spectacles. "Local woman charged in connection with the death of committee chair." And they do make it sound so antiseptic, don't they? As though it were a matter of mislaid teaspoons. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking with reassuring regularity. Newspapers are very like that, dear. They dislike the untidiness of human passion. Facts are so much easier to print than feelings. Caroline folded the paper with more vigor than necessary. Dora Hewitt, of all people. I still can't connect that quiet, fluttering soul with the idea of murder. Even knowing everything we know, it seems quite impossible. It would have seemed so to Mrs. Harcourt, too, Miss Marple said mildly. That, I think, was her undoing. She classified people, you see, put them into little mental filing drawers and assumed they would never step outside their allotted labels. Dora was timid, sickly, dependent. She never considered that desperation can make even the meek quite astonishingly brave. Or dangerous, Caroline murmured. Or dangerous, Miss Marple agreed. But if you look at it another way, one might say Mrs. Harcourt provided Dora with all the training she required. Weeks of rehearsals, as it were. The reversed violet pattern. The serving order. The insistence on 12 cups, even when 11 would do. It was all there, repeated over and over in that small cottage. One hardly thinks about what one is teaching people when one demonstrates a ritual so frequently. Caroline was silent for a while, watching her friend's neat hands at work. "Do you think," she asked at last, "that Dora will go to prison for very long?" "I imagine the law will do what it considers just," Miss Marple replied. "But I've observed juries for many years, Caroline. They tend to distinguish, in their own fashion, between the sort of person who kills from greed or malice, us, and the sort who kills from terror and hopelessness. They won't say so, of course. But you will see it in the verdict." She laid her knitting down, and reached for her teacup, regarding it with a small, inward smile. "It is curious, is it not, how it all came down to cups? 12 little vessels, all ostensibly identical, yet one set apart by the direction of a painted violet. That was so very like Mrs. Harcourt, trusting her own cleverness completely, yet overlooking how much a careful observer might learn from it. And you," Caroline said with affectionate exasperation, "noticed all that from your seat under the cherry tree, with everyone assuming you were thinking only about your knitting pattern. My dear, I was thinking very hard about my knitting pattern, Miss Marple protested. The trick is simply that people imagine an old woman can only think of one thing at a time. Outside, the village moved on in its quiet, determined way. The lamb and flag had already produced several embellished versions of the event. The rector's sermon the following Sunday would, Caroline suspected, be about truth and mercy, and Mrs. Bantry had redirected her formidable energies from committee politics to organizing a fund for distressed gentlewomen, with Dora Hewitt's situation very much in mind. "And you, Jane?" Caroline asked suddenly. "Will you be quite all right, going back to St. Mary Mead after all this?" "Oh, I think so," Miss Marple said. "One village is very like another, you know. The flowers differ slightly, the accents vary, but the human heart remains remarkably consistent. There will be a new vicar here, a new chair for the Garden Society, and in time they will quarrel over chrysanthemums as energetically as ever. Only—" She paused, eyes crinkling with that particular blend of amusement and sadness that so characterized her. "Only I fancy they will be just a little more careful with their teacups." Caroline laughed, though there was a catch in it, "and perhaps a little more careful with each other." "One may hope," Miss Marple said, "though in my experience, dear, human nature soon forgets its lessons. That is why these little upsets occur from time to time. They are rather like thunderstorms, distressing while they last, but sometimes very necessary to clear the air." The clock on the mantel chimed the hour with its usual placid certainty. Miss Marple finished her tea, folded her knitting neatly, and rose. "Well," she said, "I must see about my train. I promised to look in on young Mrs. Price Ridley's niece this week. The girl is engaged to a most unsuitable young man, and I fear there may be another sort of drama in the making. One must not neglect one's duties, Caroline. Murder is only one variation on human folly. There are so many others that require attention." Caroline accompanied her to the door, where the village lanes stretched out in deceptive innocence under a soft blue sky. As Miss Marple set off with her small, determined steps, she might have been any elderly gentlewoman returning home after a visit. Only the faintest narrowing of her eyes as she passed the rectory gate suggested that she carried with her, as always, a complete and unsentimental understanding of the village and of the world beyond it. Behind her, in the quiet rectory garden, 12 white circles still marked where the fatal cups had once rested on the grass, a pattern now invisible to all but memory. Yet in Miss Marple's mind, the arrangement remained perfectly clear. Another completed pattern filed away among countless others, to be recalled whenever human nature chose, inevitably, to repeat its mistakes.